Thank you. Oh yeah, that's a good moment to do that. I knew I'd forget something. Okay, fantastic. So the poll results are in. So it seems that 37% of you guys know what intersectionality is. So hopefully one takeaway from this webinar will be learning about interconnecting identities and intersectional theory.
So let's get started. What is intersectionality? This theoretical framework was introduced by Kimberlé Crenshaw in a 1989 paper for the University of Chicago Legal Forum, focusing on how the experiences of two identities cannot be understood by evaluating each identity independently, but rather must include the interactions of these two identities. This means that aspects of one's identities, such as gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and so on, might combine to create unique modes of discrimination. So while focusing on identifying underrepresented groups is valid, even more important is doing the work to understand the distinct layers of injustice that people of specific identities face and layers within these identities. To provide an example, a white woman who is in a low socioeconomic status has different challenges than a Black woman who is in a low socioeconomic status. And both of these people face different challenges than a man in the same race or socioeconomic status. Parsing out the implications of these differences is what it means to be intersectional. Therefore, the goal of intersectional practices is not to group everyone together, but rather cater to the individual needs of different communities in order to be fully inclusive for every individual. Now that we have a good definition of intersectionality, and hopefully you appreciate the importance of recognizing every identity that an individual has, the question now is, why are intersectional approaches important to scientists? First, let's take a step back in time. One classic example of an individual who experienced discrimination during their scientific career was Rosalind Franklin. During her career, Dr. Franklin was the victim of microaggression, where colleagues would refer to her as Rosie when she preferred Rosalind. Many of us probably know how she performed seminal work in solving the structure of DNA, receiving very little credit. And even now, textbooks still do not often refer to her data. Discrimination that Dr. Franklin experienced was gender-based. Beyond Dr. Franklin, there are many other well-known scientists who experienced biases for a range of individual or multiple identities. And here we have included pictures of some of these individuals. And now we have overlaid the identity discriminations these individuals experienced during their scientific careers. So as we continue through the webinar, we want you to consider whether you or anyone you know experiences discrimination due to any identity or identities.
Now that we have set the stage in a historic light, we want to provide an overview of the data we have to date on discrimination in science. There's been a lot of work on studying discrimination on different social identities over the past decade. This research is largely focused on the discrimination of women, ethnic minorities, and individuals with a disability. As such, the following slides will describe evidence we know for these social identity groups. However, there of course exists discrimination of other social identities and the intersection of social identities. And these forms of discrimination should be given due attention. However, for now, we are limited to the data we have to date. But we hope future iterations of this webinar may include data that better reflects the kind of discrimination that actually exists in society. Starting with gender, just to clarify, when we speak about gender in these subsequent slides, we are referring to the self-reported binary biological sex of individuals, which therefore doesn't include non-binary individuals, unfortunately, and may differ from a person's actual gender identity. So please bear this caveat in mind as we discuss data around gender discrimination. The so-called leaky pipeline metaphor has been used extensively to describe the underrepresentation of women in academic science. This phenomenon is best illustrated by the low proportion of women in senior academic ranks, shown here in orange, compared to junior ranks. Indeed, data from the European Union shows that in STEM occupations, women are not only across the board underrepresented, but the underrepresentation becomes greater at higher ranks. For example, in 2018, only 15% of grade A academic positions, i.e. the most senior positions such as professorships, were held by women. Importantly, this also holds true for the Netherlands, namely only 11% of grade A academic positions in STEM in the Netherlands are held by women. And if we analyze gender representation on an individual lab basis, we find that so-called elite and feeder labs, these are labs where the PI is an awardee of a prestigious prize or is a sort of powerhouse in terms of generating junior faculty, and which are shown in white bars in this figure, do the worst in terms of gender representation. Namely, these labs are less likely to train female scientists. By the way, this is true both for male and female elite or feeder PIs, although male PIs on the whole seem to have poorer gender ratios. This finding is particularly concerning as these labs contribute disproportionately to training our future leaders in science. Another form of gender-based discrimination is paying men and women doing the same job a different amount. Again, data from the EU shows female scientists earn on average just under 17% less than male scientists. Interestingly, the gender pay gap is even higher for the Netherlands. According to the EU, the average gender pay gap here is 25%. A similar story can be told for the US, where women are even more underpaid. Namely, the average salary of a female scientist is almost 27% lower than the average salary of a male scientist. Importantly, the gender pay gap increases when we look at higher academic ranks and older age groups. For example, for researchers aged 55 years old or older, the average gender pay gap in the Netherlands is 30.5%. The underrepresentation of women can also be observed for publication authorship, scientific recognition, and presence at seminars and conferences. For example, women, shown as green bars here, make up only 30% of senior authors on published papers. They are also much less likely to be the recipients of awards or to be invited to speak at seminars or conferences. Moreover, if we look at the rate of change over the years, it seems it would take another 50 years until we would reach gender parity, at least for senior authorship. However, gender representation seems to be improving on some measures. Here the figure shows that between 2012 and 2016, the proportion of male and female speakers became more equal with time. So another form of identity discrimination that has been studied extensively is racial discrimination. In the US, scientists belonging to an underrepresented minority, such as Black, mixed race, or Latinx, are less likely to work in scientific occupations than white scientists. Moreover, in the United Kingdom, only a tiny fraction of senior academics are Black. Namely, less than 1% of all UK professors are Black. This means that in any given British university, there are somewhere between 0 and 2 Black professors. Finally, racial inequality can also be observed at the trainee level. A recent survey found that underrepresented minority PhD students published at significantly lower rates than white PhD students. Racial disparities also exist for pay. Again, in the US, underrepresented minority scientists are paid 13.3% less on average than compared to their white counterparts. In the UK, Black academics are paid 10% less on average, as seen highlighted here on the screen. Finally, another source of discrimination is the disability status of an individual. Disability in this context refers to both physical, such as visual, hearing, or mobility impairments, as well as cognitive impairments, such as troubles with concentration, reading, etc. In the USA, scientists and engineers with a disability are less likely to work in STEM occupations than scientists who do not have a disability. Moreover, in the UK, disability disclosure rates have been found to decrease with academic rank, meaning they are particularly low among senior academics, and particularly in STEM subjects. Finally, academics in the United Kingdom who have disclosed a disability are also less likely to be earning in the high wage bracket, as is highlighted on the screen, suggesting they're also discriminated against in terms of pay. Of course, many other kinds of inequalities exist. For example, based on an individual's socioeconomic background, religious affiliation, marital status, LGBTQIA+ status, and many others. However, the data we've described so far puts individuals in discrete social identity categories, ignoring overlaps that invariably exist in any society, which may have important implications for how people are treated. For example, and as mentioned by Sarah earlier, the experience of white and black women may not be the same. And the same goes for white men who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. These complexities cannot be captured by such a simplistic approach, but rather requires an intersectional approach, where we cater to the needs of every individual and treat each person as unique. Indeed, some data suggest intersectionality matters. For example, again, this is data coming from the United Kingdom, shows that of all black female academics, only 1.9% are professors. This compares to 5.8% of white female academics. Although both of these numbers are low, it seems the representation of black women is particularly low. Moreover, the representation of men in senior academic positions also depends on race. For example, of all black male academics in the UK, only 4.5% are professors, while for white males, this number is 14.9%.
Now that you have some data to show the biases present in academic science, we want to take a step back and develop a common language to discuss intersectionality, and then get into what has been done and what can be done to counter bias in academic science. First, we want to discuss the basic terms of diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity, 4 terms often used, but also often misused. Diversity means respect for and appreciation of differences in ethnicity, gender, race, age, national origin, ability, sexual orientation, education, religion. But it's more than this. We all bring with us diverse perspectives, work experiences, lifestyles, and cultures. Diversity is all the things that differentiate people from one another. Inclusion, on the other hand, is about focusing on the needs of groups of these diverse attributes. It is valuing, respecting, and supporting all people, no matter their identities. And intersectional inclusion goes a step further to focus on the needs of individuals, rather than grouping individuals together. In a perhaps more memorable description, diversity is the mix, meaning the range of identities every person in a group has, and inclusion is getting this mix of people with different identities to work well together. So why does diversity matter? Well, diverse groups have been shown in many disciplines to promote better critical thinking, higher productivity, more innovation, and creativity. In addition, diverse groups enhance individuals' experiences by exposing others to alternative perspectives and strengthens communities. These benefits are true for academic science, which we will touch on, but in many other fields as well. All these advantages that diverse teams provide are important skills that lead to success across disciplines. Additional terms often used when discussing inclusion are equality and equity. Equality is when each individual receives the same resource. So in this example, 3 individuals with different needs are all given the same equal stand to see over the fence, when clearly this doesn't work for each of these individuals. Equity, on the other hand, is when resources are provided based on individual needs. And in this example, each of the 3 individuals are given stands that assist that individual best. While these definitions seem straightforward, in practice, differences between equality and equity can be more nuanced, but hopefully this captures the basics. We do want to highlight that equitable systems are required for permitting the opportunity for equal outcomes. In this example, when the 3 individuals were given the same stand, they could not all see over the fence. However, when provided stands that are designed best for that individual, they could then each see over the fence. Equity is what incorporates intersectional approaches to inclusion by providing resources based on individual needs. Therefore, we should strive to provide equity in all opportunities.
In order to be inclusive and to promote an equitable environment, it is first necessary to think about why there are disparities in academia. These come from our biases, and we all have them. Even children have them. So let's try to understand what they really are by first of all understanding a few basic terms. We will then talk about how discrimination and bias have impacted representation of various identity groups in academia, especially in the context of recruitment. Finally, we will discuss microaggressions and how they impact the receiver and their retention in academia in the long term. When we talk about issues relating to discrimination in science, we use a lot of terms. For the purpose of this webinar, we will focus on defining some of the few key terms. Firstly, discrimination. Discrimination, simply put, is the objective unequal treatment of different groups or individuals. For example, paying men and women a different salary for the same job. Discrimination can arise because of prejudices we have for certain groups or individuals. Then there's privilege. In this context, privilege refers to access to advantageous resources or rights simply because one belongs to a particular social group. For example, children of parents who are of a high socioeconomic status are more likely to get into better schools than children of parents who are of a low socioeconomic status. Prejudices, on the other hand, represent our negative personal beliefs about social groups, which leads us to have preconceived ideas about the qualities and characteristics of individuals in those groups, disregarding individual variations. For example, believing women are not good in science. As I mentioned earlier, these prejudices can lead to discrimination. Excuse me. Finally, a bias can be described as a preference or an inclination that leads to impartial and discriminatory judgments, actions, or policies. For example, preferring to hire someone that comes from the same country as oneself. These biases stem from our prejudices. Moreover, biases can be explicit or implicit. If a bias is explicit, this means the individual is consciously aware of their bias and expresses it in clear, prejudicial, or discriminatory acts. If a bias is implicit, on the other hand, it can only be detected indirectly, and an individual may not be aware they have them. For example, seminal studies have found people universally are able to learn men science associations much faster than women science associations. As mentioned earlier, biases are something we all have, whether implicitly or explicitly. However, that doesn't mean we can be complacent about them. The fact that biases can lead to discriminatory and unfair decisions means it is essential we try to address them, even if they are unintentional. So let's have a look at how biases affect academia. Again, we will focus on bias around gender and race, as these identities have been studied most intensively. Implicit biases have been studied extensively and extensively studied in the context of recruitment. A seminal study by Mosrikhosen et al. Showed that people rate identical CVs differently solely if the name of the CV changed from a female to a male name. Namely, in this study, participants were given fictitious CVs from student applicants to assess for a lab manager role. All CVs were identical, except half of them had a male name on them and the other half had a female name. The participants then rated the candidates on various measures. Across all measures, the CV with a female name, shown in light gray here, was rated worse than the CV with a male name. The participants even suggested a lower starting salary for the female applicants compared to the male applicants. Similar results were obtained when the CV was changed, when the name on the CV, was changed from an African-American sounding name to a white sounding name. Moreover, groundbreaking and seminal work by Veneros and Wald from 1997 found striking levels of gender bias in the evaluation of grant applications. What the authors did is they ranked the impact of applicants independently and compared their impact rank to the competency score the applicants actually got from the grant review panel. The authors found women, shown in yellow here, had to receive a 2.5 times higher impact score in order to receive the same competency assessment from the review panel. In practice, this may, for example, mean that women scientists have to be more than twice as much productive in order to be ranked equally to men. The authors also found evidence of nepotism. Specifically, applicants that had an affiliation with one of the grant review panel scored higher than those that didn't, even though the affiliated person was removed from the official review. Similarly, Hopp and colleagues found African American researchers were less likely to receive R01 funding, one of the most prestigious type of scientific funding in the US, than their white counterparts. More specifically, Hopp et al. Found applications from African American researchers were less likely to be discussed, which means that they passed the initial review stage, received lower impact scores, and were more likely to belong to less well-funded research areas than applications from white researchers. Now, institutional biases also exist. For example, Closet and colleagues found that the vast majority, i.e. 70 to 90% of junior faculty in the United States come from only 25% of all academic institutions. In practice, this suggests that the likelihood of obtaining a faculty position seems to depend a lot on where you did your training. Furthermore, new faculty, they found, are hardly ever recruited from less prestigious institutions. Specifically, only about 10% of trainees move up the academic social hierarchy. Here, institutional prestige is defined by how many junior faculty an institute produces. Let's take an example. MIT produces a lot of academics that go on to taking up a junior faculty position at other universities. So its faculty production rate is high, and so is its institutional prestige in this study. Whereas Washington University may not produce as many junior faculty as MIT, and thus has a lower institutional prestige score. Moreover, and this is what's really important, is that the faculty production rate influences where a junior academic is likely to obtain a faculty position. Namely, a person doing their training at Washington University is very unlikely to obtain a faculty position at MIT, whereas the reverse is true. Many junior faculty at Washington will have come from MIT. Moreover, biases around institutional prestige also seem to influence an institute's or a university's ability to obtain research funding. For example, more prestigious institutions or labs, this is in the US, and here prestige is based on graduate school ranking from the US News and World Report, and they're shown in yellow in the figure, get awarded bigger grants. In fact, 40% of grant money awarded by the National Institute for Health in the United States goes to just 10% of PIs. And at the institution level, 80% of grants were distributed among just 10% of universities. This finding is particularly interesting, given the study also found that the more prestigious institutions were actually less productive than other institutions. It's evident biases exert a strong influence on academic life, both at the individual level as well as the level of institutions. Importantly, discrimination is bad for science. The benefits of diversity for decision-making and productivity have been well documented. For example, Al-Shebly and colleagues found a clear correlation between the diversity of a research team, shown on the x-axis, and the impact of the published research, as indicated by the number of citations over a 5-year period, and shown on the y-axis. Similarly, a fascinating study by Hofstra and colleagues found that individuals belonging to a minority group, such as being female or non-white, are more likely to make novel discoveries in their doctoral studies than individuals belonging to a majority group. To give an example, Lillian Bruch was one of the leading researchers who discovered HIV infections came from non-human primates. A seminal finding by all accounts. And she did this at a time when female biologists were highly underrepresented. In fact, Hofstra and colleagues found that the more underrepresented an individual PhD researcher was, the more innovations they produced. The graph on the left shows the correlation between the number of innovations introduced in a PhD thesis by female researchers and how represented female researchers were at the time in the scientific subject. The graph on the right shows the same, but for non-white PhD researchers. Both graphs show a clear negative correlation, suggesting a minority status is associated with a higher degree of scientific innovation. So what can we do? First, we need to be aware of our biases and accept that we're all biased. Accepting this means we should always be self-reflective and second-guess our decisions and actions, even though this may lead to uncomfortable feelings or tension. We should try to challenge biases when we see them and be the ally of those who we identify as being discriminated against. To help educate ourselves about our own biases, one can take implicit bias tests and participate in privilege walks.
Thanks, Freyja, for presenting data highlighting how damaging discrimination can be to STEM. I would now like to switch gears from data and focus on introducing you to a subtle form of targeted discrimination that can be encountered by individuals on a daily basis, termed microaggressions. So let me begin by defining the term microaggressions. Microaggressions were first described by Daryl Wing Su to be the everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBTQ+ populations, and other marginalized people experience in their day-to-day integrations. I really like this definition of microaggressions because it emphasizes that these insults can be encountered by individuals every day due to their identity or identities. Some verbal microaggressions can even be meant to serve as compliments, and the microaggressor might be unaware that they are reaffirming a negative stereotype about the receiver. This can stem from an unconscious bias, as Freyja mentioned, which is why it is important to recognize our own biases and work actively against them. Now, here are some examples of microaggressions. You don't speak Spanish? So what does your hair look like today? So like, what are you? So you're Chinese, right? You don't act like a normal Black person. So what do you guys speak in Japan? Asian? The examples provided here were of verbal microaggressions, and some of them seemed like harmless comments perpetuating a stereotype. But that's exactly what makes them distressing for individuals receiving them. Now imagine encountering these on a daily basis and being unable to pinpoint exactly why you're hurt by them, or being a part of a group that simply might not understand why it felt like a big deal to you. As I mentioned before, individuals making such statements may not necessarily be meaning to be hurtful or not even know that they are biased against a certain group. So that is why I think it's important to encourage people to have open conversations, to enable us all to recognize the hidden biases we have and actively try to work against them. Remember that microaggressions can be nonverbal too. Actions such as eye rolling, talking over someone at meetings, or excluding someone from group activities because of their perceived identities are also examples of microaggressions. So now that you've been introduced to the concept of microaggressions, can you think about whether you have heard, received, or possibly even given a comment like one of those in your scientific environment? Here are some real-life examples that we have heard in an academic setting. I think you're smart despite being a woman.
Does your bachelor's degree even count?
You give good presentation for someone who has an accent.
You're too pretty to be a scientist.
Of course you received that award.
How did you get your job?
It must have been hard for you to do your PhD. People from India are normally lazy, aren't they?
You look so good for our lab. You're the ultimate diversity candidate.
You people.
Okay, so now that we've established that microaggressions can be hurtful, how do we counter them in our environments and make our workplaces more inclusive? Let's do this together by starting with ourselves. Let us all reflect and recognize our own biases and the potential impact that they may have on others. Then, if someone does alert us to a microaggression that we've engaged in, let's not adopt a defensive stance, but listen to the person, apologize, and recognize what we can alter in the future. We should also all be allies to marginalized groups and identify and reduce discrimination in our workplaces. However, remember that not everyone wants or needs someone else to stand up for them. But what can be done is to subtly ask the aggressor to recognize the potential impact of their actions or words and speak to the victim one-on-one. Now, granted, we do not need to be friends with all our colleagues, but we do need to be accepting of everyone regardless of their individual identities and be respectful and supportive. We recommend taking this dignity pledge and to get us started towards working to build inclusive work environments. And we will be presenting more resources during the rest of this talk. Now, in this last section of the webinar, we'd like to highlight what we know so far is being done to make science more inclusive and make some suggestions for what can be done at all levels of academia. Firstly, what is being done at the level of hiring? There have recently been a number of initiatives which aim to promote diversity and inclusivity when hiring new faculty. For example, some universities in the US, such as the Universities of California at Berkeley and Davis and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, are making it a requirement that new faculty applicants write a diversity statement. This is a short statement that aims at describing the candidate's experience of working to promote inclusivity and their plans to continue this work in their new roles. Numerous universities and funding bodies across Europe have women-only fellowships, which aim to rebalance the historical underrepresentation of women in science, particularly at the faculty level. And you can see some examples here on the screen, including for those in the Netherlands. I'd like to add here that fellowships that aim to increase the representation of a minority group are helpful in addressing inequalities in academia. However, applications for any minority-focused opportunities need to clearly state their requirements to ensure a fair application process. And what can funding agencies do to be less biased? Here's an interesting study from the Canadian Institute for Health and Research. The authors conducted a study to highlight the consequences for gender representation for awarded grants when the grant review explicitly focused on the caliber of the candidate, so-called foundation grants, versus when it focused on the quality of the proposed project. They found that the candidate-focused approach was biased towards male candidates, shown here in dark green, when compared to the project-based approach, although both showed that men were at a slight advantage. Now, while the male advantage appears small for each grant application, imagine that over time, this accumulates to a very large advantage for male scientists, as is shown here on the right in green. This plot simulates the cumulative grant money that a researcher of each gender would acquire over time, given unequal success rates. Grant money awarded to women is shown in red. Now, the solid line simulates money accumulated for candidate-focused grants, and the dashed line shows the same, but for project-focused grants. And the figure clearly shows that over time, women accumulate dramatically less grant money, particularly if the grants are candidate-focused. This suggests that adjusting the criteria for funding applications to focus on the quality of the proposed project rather than on the candidate may indeed be a stepping stone to making scientific funding fairer. And what are funding agencies doing to be more inclusive? Well, prestigious funding agencies in the US and the UK, such as the National Sciences Foundation, the NSF, and the Wellcome Trust, have a policy that funding will be taken away from scientists that have been accused of or have been found to engage in workplace bullying. And the NSF explicitly encourages collaborations that bring together diverse groups within their Includes program. Then a Swedish granting agency is also discussing the possibility of always awarding 50% of announced grants to women, irrespective of how many women apply. And in the UK, they have the Athena Swan Charter, which encourages institutions to apply policies promoting gender equality, and in fact awards institutions that do so. Finally, what are journals doing to be more inclusive? Some editors explicitly encourage women, underrepresented minorities, and trainees to sign up to be peer reviewers, while others have started to provide statistics on submissions and reviews and implement review methods that include an open discussion between reviewers, which can help mitigate biases. Some also offer open or double-blind peer reviews. And all of these have been undertaken with a view to try and reduce bias during the review process, and it remains to be seen which one of these or whether all of these will work.
Renuka just covered some of what is being doing in different sectors of academic science. Now we want to take the last bit of time to discuss what you and others can do to be as inclusive and fully supportive as possible. Our eLife Ambassadors group recently released a few resources pictured here, which are guidelines for inclusive practices in hiring, mentoring, grant review, reference, and manuscript review. We chose these 5 practices as we think they are vital components within academic science that are also largely introduce bias, ultimately resulting in hindered success of individuals that experience this discrimination. Here we will go through what individuals can do at different stages of their career, focusing within the structure of academic science. Scientists largely work within lab groups, as you probably know, composed of students, postdocs, staff, and a lab head or PI. So what can we as members of research labs do to be as inclusive as possible? Renuka mentioned before that you can be an advocate to marginalized groups by helping to identify and reduce discrimination through speaking with colleagues about inappropriate behavior, supporting individuals when they have been discriminated against, among other actions. This holds for within a lab. If your coworker is acting in a discriminatory way, speak out, either to that individual or to the lab head. You should also attend diversity training to learn more about inclusion and help to identify your own biases. This can be at your institution. In these trainings, you may also learn how you can assist locally. But also some large conferences now have diversity and equity sessions. In addition to formal training, spend time educating yourself through reading and conversation with your colleagues, mentors, and friends. We are all continuously learning for our scientific endeavors, and enhancing knowledge for better inclusion is no different. At the end, we will provide some books and articles that have helped us with our continuous learning, but there are many resources also freely available. I personally have found NPR podcasts and TED Talks to be very helpful in my non-scientific education of social injustices. It is important to be inclusive of all lab members and individuals to social events. If the event is for a lab, don't disinclude any individual, even if in the past they have not been interested or have not been able to attend, as you may not know the circumstances. Furthermore, making sure the social event is one in which individuals can attend and would feel welcomed through selecting foods, activities, and more that are inclusive to all lab members. Importantly, share lab duties equitably. Don't assume a lab member should be doing a specific or more lab chores due to a certain organizational trait or stereotype that you or others have toward that person's identity that suggests a particular chore is a fit for them. For example, many anecdotal conversations I have had end up noting that women do more organizational or schedule planning within the lab than men. This means that men are allocated that time to focus on science while women are not. While the organizational task itself may be one the woman prefers, the time commitments of non-science work must be equal between individuals. To be an ally, one thing to do is to use individuals' chosen pronouns, meaning he, him, she, her, they, them, they, their. Importantly, treat others how they want to be treated. Do not assume everyone wants to be treated the same, and do not assume how someone wants to be treated because of a stereotype or prejudice associated with one of the identities of that individual. It is important to remember that at some point, or perhaps even now, you may be a supervisor to individuals. A supervisor is not just a lab head. This could be your supervision of an undergraduate or new lab member. Therefore, you should practice intersectional inclusivity now, as every individual in a position of power must respect what that power means in terms of supporting mentees. Within the research lab, a PI or lab head is the leader of the group. This means you have a very important requirement of your position in the way that you have a large power and influence over the individual's current position and future career. One suggestion we have is to require diversity statements, which we covered, for all levels of hiring within the lab. These statements can make you aware of whether individuals consider the importance of inclusion in their work. You should make sure you hire diverse trainees. As Freyja mentioned, there is literature showing that individuals tend to hire people who are reflections of themselves, and therefore it is important to avoid this bias. As I mentioned before, diverse teams result in more innovative and creative work, along with strengthening the work community. And as Freyja mentioned, within publishing of scientific research, this means that publications from diverse teams overall end up with higher impact factors. So a diverse team benefits everyone in many ways. You should promote and identify appropriate role models for your mentees. We all complement a trainee's scientific training through additional mentors when that individual needs to learn a new technique, for example. But another mentor that may be important is an identity mentor. Sometimes it is difficult for underrepresented individuals to identify mentors who share identities with them. So if you can identify additional mentors that might support an individual through a mechanism that you cannot, such as being a first-generation PhD, navigating the academic system as a non-binary person, and more, connecting that individual with the proposed mentor could really support your trainee. Generating and using a lab expectations manual can provide transparency for your thoughts on both the scientific and social environment of your lab, including the importance of inclusion. Recently, members of our initiative within the ambassadors released an inclusive template for a lab expectations document that is available for individual labs to modify and use however they would like. It is extremely important as a supervisor of any kind to be fair and equitable in your treatment of trainees. For example, it can be easy to spend additional time speaking with more social members of the lab. However, setting up timed meetings with trainees provides support in a more equitable way. Relatedly, every individual does not require the same type of mentorship, and so you should alter your mentoring style to best assist each of your trainees' needs and their career goals, rather than having every trainee fit into one mentorship style. This also means always supporting your mentees in public, in casual conversations, with colleagues, or to other trainees. A way to support an individual, for example, is to use that individual's chosen pronouns, as we mentioned previously. We also recommend undergoing bias and diversity training where you can learn your biases in order to take steps to mitigate these biases and hopefully understand how to be inclusive in your mentoring. So beyond members of the lab and lab heads, what can our institutions do? Similar to our suggestion of individual lab heads, institutions could require diversity statements more regularly. This would include both staff and faculty hires. Institutions should make it a primary goal to increase the number of diverse students. This may mean altering how we both recruit and accept both undergraduate and graduate students. Furthermore, we need to focus not just on recruiting those individuals, but providing support to allow those individuals to succeed, meaning provide the appropriate mechanisms for all students to succeed. It is our purpose as educators and mentors to provide the resources and accommodations for all students to succeed. Importantly, requiring faculty, staff, and students to undergo bias and inclusion training. This should not just be a one-time training, but regular training throughout an individual's tenure at the institution. Job postings for all university hires should be inclusive. For example, using gender-neutral pronouns within the job ad and posting the ad to diverse host locations. One important modification that institutions could make is to be more family-friendly through making work hours compatible with daycare and schools, having daycares on-site for university members, permitting work from home as able, and also providing equal parental leave. It is common for mothers to take longer leave times relative to fathers, but one recent study showed that within a heterosexual couple, for every 1 month of paternity leave a father takes, his partner's salary goes up by almost 7%. This suggests that paternal involvement in childcare and parental leave could be one factor behind unexplained earnings gap. Importantly, among the fathers, they reported no effect of spousal leave on their earnings. Therefore, if institutions provided equal leave, perhaps the salary gap broadly reported between women and men would decrease. Finally, making sure specific quotas for different identities are reached on various committees or boards. For example, recent data has shown that the percent of female speakers at a conference directly relates to the percent of females on the organizing committee, confirming the importance for diverse organizational committees. I imagine something similar would hold true if one analyzed the representation of other identities, such as race, geographical location, and more. Publications containing scientific data are currency in academic science. We succeed and fail by the rate, impact, and acceptance of our scientific publications. Careers advance largely due to success in publishing. Therefore, it is important to reduce bias that publishing journals and manuscript reviewers have for underrepresented groups. One of our recently released short guidelines is designed to reduce bias in manuscript review. And we also have suggestions for what journal editors could do. Finally, what about funding agencies? Hand in hand with publications for academic science goes acquiring research funding. As Freyja reported, this aspect of science is also fraught with discrimination. We also generated a short guideline for grant review that can help reduce bias in this vital component of academic science. Briefly, funding agencies can alter their review processes to make this process more fair and reduce biases. Again, aspects of these more fair reviews can be altered by us when we review grant applications, as we outlined in our guideline. We want to end by emphasizing that many initial steps in promoting inclusive practices are to educate yourself. Here we have provided a list of some books that we have found useful, focusing on many identities, which is important when considering how to be inclusive for each individual. And here are the articles referenced throughout our presentation that we also found informative.
Now, before we end, we'd like to have one more anonymous quick poll just to ask whether you are now more things you may be able to do to be more inclusive in your workspace. Great. Okay, so the results are in. So 91% of you say that answer that question yes. So that's we are delighted to hear that. So just before we end, we'd like to thank you all for joining us. We hope that you got some ideas for how to improve inclusion in your own settings. We also like to thank the researchers whose work we presented today, and we sincerely hope we've done it justice. We hope that the data presented impresses upon you that it is essential to conduct more research into discrimination in STEM to highlight disparities faced within identities in addition to the ones we have presented here. Further research should also take a more intersectional approach and consider multiple identities. This kind of research will be important to present a fuller picture, to challenge authorities and policymakers to make the system more inclusive, and for all of us to be able to bridge those gaps as young scientists who might be future leaders within STEM. We have made these slides available on Figshare, so please feel free to access them. And now we are happy to open the floor to discussion or questions from you guys. Thank you all for listening.